Here is the paradox that the power cartographer sees when they look at the current Gulf crisis from sufficient altitude. The United States is spending billions of dollars, deploying carrier strike groups, managing ceasefire frameworks, absorbing the credibility cost of reversed ultimatums, and exhausting its diplomatic capital managing a conflict that is simultaneously, in real time, making China richer, stronger, and more diplomatically relevant. Every hour that American attention is consumed by the Gulf is an hour that Beijing is spending on something else. And the something else is the part of this story that the coverage is not telling you.
Curious. The bill that arrives late in this architecture is not the one Iran is accumulating. It is the one the United States is running up, in military expenditure, in diplomatic capital, in the opportunity cost of attention that is not being applied to the theaters and technologies where the actual great power competition of the 21st century will be decided. China does not need to win the Gulf crisis. China needs the Gulf crisis to continue long enough for Beijing to consolidate the advantages it is building in the space that American attention has vacated. That is the strategy nobody is explaining. Tonight I want to map it with precision. Map it from the top. While American policymakers are managing ceasefire deadlines, reversed ultimatums, Pakistan mediations that go nowhere, and Omani back channels that may or may not be producing results, what is actually happening in Beijing? What decisions are being made? What investments are being accelerated? What diplomatic relationships are being deepened? That will define the balance of power not in the Gulf in 2026, but in the broader contest for global influence in 2035 and beyond. The answer to that question is the most important geopolitical story of this moment. And it is not on the front page. I map how great powers accumulate and spend strategic advantage, how the decisions made during periods of distraction by one power create durable gains for another that outlast the specific crisis that created the distraction. The historical record of this mechanism is extensive and consistent. The United States consolidated its own global position most rapidly during periods when its primary rivals were consumed by costly engagements elsewhere. Britain's decline accelerated during periods when London was managing imperial crises that consumed resources and attention. The specific content of what China is building right now, while Washington manages the Gulf, is visible to anyone who looks. Tonight I want to look. One sentence. China is executing a documented strategy of free-riding on American power in the Gulf, allowing the United States to bear the military, diplomatic, and credibility costs of managing regional stability, while simultaneously using the attention vacuum created by American distraction to accelerate the specific technological, infrastructural, and diplomatic investments that will determine who holds structural power in the global system a decade from now. Start with the map of what free-riding on American power actually means in operational terms, because the phrase is used loosely and deserves precision. The United States Fifth Fleet maintains freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. That freedom of navigation benefits every country that imports Gulf crude, including China, which imports more Gulf crude than anyone else. China contributes nothing to the cost of maintaining that freedom. No naval assets, no base contributions, no operational burden sharing. Washington pays, Beijing benefits. That is the definition of free riding. The annual cost of the U.S. military presence in the Gulf, the Fifth Fleet, the forward deployed forces, the intelligence architecture, the logistical infrastructure, is estimated by analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at somewhere between $50 and $80 billion per year when all direct and indirect costs are included. China's energy security in the Gulf is underwritten by that expenditure. Beijing has never been asked to contribute to it and has never offered to do so. The bill for Gulf stability is paid almost entirely by the United States and its allies. The benefits flow to everyone who imports Gulf crude. China receives approximately 25% of those benefits, the proportion of global crude trade that passes through Hormuz to Chinese refineries, while paying approximately 0% of the costs. Now map what China does with the capital it does not spend on Gulf security. The People's Liberation Army Navy has been expanding at a rate that has no historical precedent among major powers in peacetime. China has launched more naval tonnage in the past 5 years than the entire current Royal Navy. It has built carrier strike groups, amphibious assault ships, and a submarine fleet that is qualitatively and quantitatively more capable than it was a decade ago. It has built overseas logistics facilities in Djibouti, in Gwadar, in Rhim, that give the plan the ability to sustain operations far from Chinese shores for the first time. All of that has been funded by a defense budget that is large but not as large as America's, and made possible in part by the fact that China is not spending $50 to $80 billion per year maintaining Gulf security for the global economy. Now map the specific assets China is building while American attention is in the Gulf. The coverage presents this conflict as the dominant story of the current moment. From Beijing's perspective, the current moment is an opportunity window, a period in which American diplomatic, military, and political bandwidth is substantially consumed by a regional crisis that China can influence at the margins without absorbing its costs. Technology. China's semiconductor industry has been under American export control pressure since 2022. Restrictions designed to prevent Beijing from acquiring the advanced chips necessary to compete in artificial intelligence, advanced weapons systems, and next-generation telecommunications. The export control campaign requires sustained American attention, diplomatic pressure on allies to align their own export control regimes, and legal and enforcement infrastructure to close loopholes. While the Gulf crisis consumes the attention of the National Security Council, the State Department, and senior intelligence officials, the monitoring and enforcement of semiconductor export controls is receiving less senior-level attention than it otherwise would. Beijing is aware of this. Chinese semiconductor firms have been documenting the enforcement gaps that emerge during periods of American distraction and exploiting them systematically. Trade routes, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure investment program spanning Asia, Africa, and Europe, continues to develop while American attention is elsewhere. The specific projects most consequential for long-term power competition are not the ones that generate headlines. They are the port concessions, the railway connections, the digital infrastructure installations that quietly create Chinese operational presence in strategically significant locations. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which gives Beijing access to Gwadar on the Arabian Sea, bypassing the Strait of Malacca and providing an alternative energy import route that reduces Chinese Hormuz dependency, is being developed with a pace that correlates inversely with the level of American attention being paid to Pakistan. When Washington is focused on Pakistan as a Gulf crisis mediator, it is less focused on what China is building in Gwadar. That is not a coincidence. Diplomatic relationships. The Gulf crisis has consumed significant American diplomatic capital in managing relationships with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait, the Gulf state allies whose cooperation is necessary for U.S. military basing, intelligence sharing, and the maintenance of the petrodollar architecture. While those relationships are being stressed by the management demands of the current crisis, China is deepening its own relationships with the same Gulf states, not through security guarantees, which would require military presence Beijing is not ready to provide, but through trade agreements, investment commitments, and the cultivation of the personal relationships between Chinese officials and Gulf counterparts that produce durable diplomatic access. The 2023 normalization was the visible product of years of that cultivation. The current cultivation is producing the next visible product, which will emerge at a time of Beijing's choosing. Now map the doctrine behind the restraint, the internal Chinese strategic framework that explains why Beijing has chosen this posture rather than a more assertive one. The coverage defaults to describing Chinese restraint as caution, as risk aversion, as the pragmatic behavior of a country that does not want to be drawn into an American conflict. All of those descriptions are partially accurate. None of them captures the full strategic logic. The doctrine that most precisely describes Chinese behavior in this crisis is what Chinese strategic thinkers call the period of strategic opportunity, a concept that appears in Chinese Communist Party documents from the early 2000s and has been explicitly referenced in PLA strategic planning. The core proposition is that China faces a finite window, roughly the period from now until approximately 2035, in which it can consolidate its technological, economic, and military position relative to the United States before American power is mobilized more directly against Chinese interests. Within that window, every year in which China is not drawn into a costly military or political confrontation is a year in which the consolidation continues. Every year in which the United States is consumed by a costly engagement elsewhere accelerates the consolidation by reducing American capacity to focus on the China challenge. The Gulf crisis, from this perspective, is not a problem for Beijing. It is a gift. It is consuming American attention, resources, and credibility at a rate that is directly beneficial to Chinese strategic positioning. Beijing's minimal but calibrated engagement, the Shi-Salman call, the private red lines to Tehran, the validation of the piracy framing, is sufficient to protect Chinese immediate interests without producing the level of direct involvement that would attract sustained American pressure. The restraint is not passive. It is the most active and sophisticated strategic posture in the current theater, and it is working. Now map what the free-riding architecture is actually dismantling, because this is the dimension that converts the story from interesting to urgent. China is not just benefiting from the Gulf stability that American power maintains. It is simultaneously investing in the alternative architecture that will make American power in the Gulf progressively less necessary to Chinese interests, and therefore progressively less relevant as a source of American leverage over Beijing. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor's Gwadar port, when fully developed, gives China an oil import route that does not pass through the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca. The Myanmar pipeline and port infrastructure gives China another Malacca bypass. The network of Chinese port concessions and logistics facilities across the Indian Ocean littoral, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Tanzania, in Djibouti, is creating a Chinese maritime presence that reduces Beijing's dependence on the sea lanes that the U.S. Navy currently controls. Each of those investments makes American maritime power slightly less essential to Chinese energy security. Each is being built while American attention is in the Gulf. The yuan settlement architecture, the SIAP's alternative to SWIFT, the yuan-denominated crude futures, the bilateral currency swap arrangements with Gulf states, is creating an alternative financial infrastructure that reduces Chinese dependence on the dollar system that underlies American financial leverage. Each yuan-settled crude transaction is a brick in that alternative architecture. Each is being transacted while American financial officials are managing sanctions enforcement against Iranian entities, rather than the strategic-level question of what replaces the dollar system in global commodity trade. The diplomatic architecture, the 2023 normalization, the Shi-Salman call, the Huawei telecommunications infrastructure installed in Gulf state networks, the Chinese AI and surveillance technology sold to Gulf state security services, is creating a Chinese presence in the Gulf's information and security architecture that has no precedent. American intelligence officials who are focused on Iranian nuclear activities and ceasefire compliance are spending less time on the question of what Chinese telecommunications and AI infrastructure in Gulf state networks means for American intelligence operations in the region 10 years from now. Now answer the question the informed adult needs answered. What would actually force China to abandon restraint and enter the conflict directly? Because mapping the strategy requires mapping its limits. the specific conditions under which Beijing's calculation changes, and the costs of free riding exceed the benefits. The first threshold is a genuine Hormuz closure of sufficient duration to produce a Chinese economic crisis. We established in the previous video that the 90% figure and the private red line on Hormuz closure have thus far prevented this scenario. But if a Hormuz closure occurred, through miscalculation, through IRGC unilateral action, through an Israeli strike on Iranian infrastructure that triggered an Iranian mine-laying operation, and lasted more than 2 to 3 weeks, Chinese economic damage would reach a level that the political leadership could not absorb without a visible response. At that point, Beijing's free-riding strategy would require modification. China would need to be seen as actively contributing to a solution rather than benefiting passively from the crisis. The nature of that contribution, naval escort, diplomatic mediation, economic pressure on Iran, would depend on the specific scenario. But the threshold is real. The second threshold is a direct attack on Chinese-flagged vessels or Chinese nationals that produces casualties at a scale requiring a public response. We established in the last video that Houthi targeting selectivity has thus far avoided this scenario. But the selectivity is not guaranteed indefinitely. A miscalculation, a Houthi strike on a vessel whose Chinese cargo interest was not identified in targeting intelligence, could produce the casualty event that forces Beijing's hand. The Chinese domestic political system cannot absorb Chinese naval casualties without a response that is visible to the domestic audience. The response would not necessarily be military, but it would require abandoning the strategic invisibility that makes the free-riding posture sustainable. The third threshold is a U.S.-China confrontation over Gulf operations that Beijing cannot manage diplomatically. The specific scenario, a U.S. naval interdiction of a vessel with documented Chinese state enterprise cargo interest, not a shadow fleet vessel, but a vessel whose Chinese ownership is publicly known. At that point, the piracy framing that Iran has deployed becomes available to China as well. And Beijing's domestic political system cannot accept what would be characterized as American piracy against Chinese commercial assets without a response that tests the free-riding calculus in ways that Beijing would strongly prefer to avoid. The historical precedent that maps most precisely onto this strategy is not Chinese. It is American. The United States executed exactly this strategy during the first 4 decades of the 20th century, free-riding on British naval power while building the economic, technological, and financial architecture that would eventually replace British dominance. American corporations invested in global markets while British naval power kept the sea lanes open. American financial architecture, the Federal Reserve, Wall Street's growing role in international lending, displaced British financial primacy incrementally, while London managed the imperial commitments that consumed British strategic attention. When British power finally contracted in the Suez Crisis of 1956, which the United States itself engineered, the alternative American architecture was already in place. China is executing the American playbook of 1900 to 1945 against the United States of 2025. The specific content is different. Technology instead of heavy industry, WAN settlement instead of Bretton Woods, Belt and Road instead of Monroe Doctrine. But the structural logic is identical. Let the incumbent power bear the costs of maintaining the system while building the alternative architecture that will eventually replace it. The bill for that strategy arrives late. It arrives at the moment when the incumbent power realizes that the alternative architecture is more developed than it appeared, and that the window for preventing its consolidation has already closed. The United States faces the most uncomfortable strategic position. It must continue managing the Gulf crisis, because the alternative is a regional collapse with immediate and severe consequences, while simultaneously watching China build the architecture that will eventually make American Gulf dominance obsolete. There is no version of the current situation in which Washington can simply disengage from the Gulf to focus on China. The Gulf crisis is real, the consequences of mismanagement are severe, and the American security commitments to Gulf state allies are not reversible on a timeline relevant to the current crisis. The Gulf is a trap, not one that was set deliberately by Beijing, but one that American strategic commitments created, and that China is content to see maintained. China faces the mirror image constraint. The free-riding strategy works only as long as Chinese immediate interests are not directly threatened. The three thresholds we mapped, Hormuz closure, Chinese casualty event, direct U.S.-China confrontation over Gulf operations, each represent a point at which the cost of restraint exceeds the benefit, and Beijing is forced into the conflict it has specifically structured its strategy to avoid. The discipline required to stay below all three thresholds simultaneously, while Iran's escalation decisions are not fully under Chinese control, is the fundamental risk in Beijing's posture. The strategy is brilliant. It is also fragile at the margins. The informed adult watching this needs to understand the most precise version of what is happening. China is not winning the Gulf crisis. China is winning the opportunity cost of the Gulf crisis, the compounding advantage that accrues from every month in which American attention, resources, and credibility are consumed by a regional engagement that does not produce durable American strategic gains. That is a different kind of winning. It is slower, less visible, and more durable than any battlefield outcome, and it is happening right now, in real time, in the space between the Gulf headlines. Scenario 1. The Gulf crisis resolves within months through the Omani back channel or a Chinese-facilitated framework. American attention returns to the China challenge. The free-riding window closes. China has gained some months of consolidation time and some diplomatic credibility from the Xi Salman call, but the structural balance has not fundamentally shifted. This is the scenario American policymakers are hoping for, and it is possible. Scenario 2. The Gulf crisis extends for 1 to 2 years through repeated ceasefire cycles, extension reversals, and managed escalation that never quite tips into full conflict. American attention, military resources, and diplomatic capital remain substantially committed to the Gulf for that entire period. China's consolidation of semiconductor alternatives, Belt and Road connectivity, WAN settlement architecture, and Gulf diplomatic relationships advances by 1 to 2 years, relative to a scenario in which American attention is fully focused on the China challenge. At the end of the crisis, the structural balance has shifted measurably. This is the most likely scenario. Scenario 3. One of the three Chinese thresholds is crossed, forcing Beijing into the conflict. China's free-riding strategy is abandoned. The Gulf crisis becomes a U.S.-China confrontation in which both powers absorb costs, neither benefits from the other's distraction, and the global system faces the first direct great power confrontation since the Cold War. This is the scenario both sides have the strongest incentives to avoid. The probability is low. The consequence is severe enough that mapping it is necessary. Scenario 4. The Gulf crisis produces a multilateral resolution architecture that formally includes China as a co-guarantor of regional security, the scenario we mapped in the previous video. China transitions from free rider to stakeholder. The cost of Gulf security is shared more broadly. American strategic attention is partially freed. Chinese strategic interest in Gulf stability is formalized. This is the most constructive long-term outcome and the one that requires the most institutional adaptation from all parties. It is possible. It is not currently the trajectory. If you are an informed adult who has been watching the Gulf crisis and wondering why it feels like the United States is paying a very high price for outcomes that seem uncertain, the map I just drew explains why. Every dollar spent on Fifth Fleet operations, Every diplomatic capital unit spent managing ceasefire frameworks, every credibility unit consumed by reversed ultimatums is $1. A unit, a resource that is not being spent on the technology competition, the trade route contest, and the financial architecture battle that will determine structural power in 2035. This is not an argument for disengaging from the Gulf. The immediate consequences of Gulf instability are real and severe for energy markets, for allied relationships, for regional populations. It is an argument for clarity about what the Gulf engagement costs, what it produces, and what China is building in the space that American attention has vacated. Clarity about those three things is the precondition for a strategy that manages the Gulf without surrendering the broader contest. The bill for China's free-riding strategy arrives late, at the moment when the alternative architecture is sufficiently developed that reversing it requires a confrontation the United States is not positioned for. We do not know exactly when that moment arrives. We do know that it is closer today than it was at the beginning of the Gulf crisis. And we know, from the map of what China is building while America is distracted, that the bill is compounding. Let me draw the final map. China is gaining by letting America deal with the mess. The gain is not in the Gulf. It is in the semiconductor labs, the Gwadar port construction sites, the Yuan settlement networks, the Huawei telecommunications installations in Gulf state networks, and the diplomatic relationships that are being deepened in Beijing's meeting rooms, while American officials are managing ceasefire deadlines. The gain is measured in months of consolidation time, in alternative infrastructure developed, in diplomatic relationships deepened, in financial architecture extended. It is real, it is compounding, and it is almost entirely invisible in the Gulf crisis coverage. The bill that arrives late in this architecture is not a single payment. It is a series of moments, a technology gap that has become unbridgeable, a trade route that has become structurally embedded, a financial alternative that has achieved sufficient scale to be self-sustaining, at each of which the United States discovers that the window for a less costly response has already closed. Each of those moments is being funded in part by the opportunity cost of Gulf engagement. The Gulf crisis is real. The strategy China is executing around it is more real, and the coverage that explains the Gulf without explaining the Chinese strategy around it is giving you half a map. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If you were designing American foreign policy from scratch today, knowing that China is executing this specific free-riding consolidation strategy while American attention is consumed by the Gulf, what single structural change would you make to prevent the bill from arriving before the window for response closes? Not a tactical adjustment, a structural one. Leave your answer in the comments. The most strategically precise responses I will read in the follow-up.